Katie, I would like to, first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed by me. As you know, this is going to be mainly used for, students of emergency management who are going to become professionals, something you've done in your past, and I hope you can talk about a little bit as well. But maybe you can begin with just telling us a bit about yourself before we get into, the professional stuff.
Yeah, sure. My name is Katie McPherson, and I was privileged enough to graduate from York U through the Master's in Disaster and Emergency Management program. I think I was the second cohort to go through and graduated in 2010. And I entered that program originally because I had been on the ground when the tsunami struck Thailand in 2004. And so that piqued my interest in emergency management, and particularly I raised more questions than answers for me about global disaster management. And so I knew I wanted to pursue a career in that. Today I live in Whitehorse. I've recently moved here after working for about 8 years with the city of Vancouver in a number of roles ranging from emergency management, a few secondments that I think we'll speak to, and most recently I was the Chief Resilience Officer for the city since 2017. So today I'm doing a bit of my own consulting, focusing on my own resilience, and doing a little bit of permaculture farming as well.
Okay. One thing I would like to talk to you about is the whole Trans Mountain project. So this was maybe it's not dead yet, but it certainly went on for many, many years, involved risk analyses by Trans Mountain pipelines, and the engagement of many communities, including the city of Vancouver when you were an emergency manager there. Mm-hmm. And I'd like you to give us your perspective on the process, of the whole application by Trans Mountain to build a pipeline, including the risk assessment and the government, the city response to, their risk assessment and so forth.
So I have to say this is probably concurrently one of the most challenging and frustrating, but also rewarding and I think arguably successful projects that I have been able to be a part of. I was incredibly grateful that the city of Vancouver seconded me to be a part, to be one of the leaders of the Trans Mountain assessment team, and that they recognized that although the National Energy Board didn't necessarily agree that the city of Vancouver was directly affected in a number of ways, that we felt that we were, that this pipeline had significant implications for not only emergency management, but for the citizens of Vancouver. So the project started in 2013. I remember I attended a public meeting or a stakeholder meeting for the Trans Mountain Pipeline in my capacity as manager of emergency planning, and asked some questions about spill modeling from the 400, I think it was an increase by 400 a year, maybe 400% increase in the number of tankers plying the waters of the Burrard Inlet every year. So I'd asked them, had they done any modeling? Had they done any risk assessment associated with that? It was clear that they hadn't. It was clear that there was no intention of doing that work, and they had determined that that was out of scope for the Trans Mountain Pipeline project. And so that was very, very early stages in their application process. And I took that to my director, to our city manager, and just said, hey, I've got some red flags here. Like, if there's a big spill here, the Coast Guard is responsible for it. They don't have the capacity for it. But not only that, the Coast Guard doesn't actually respond to support our community. And if we have a major spill here in Vancouver, there are social, economic, environmental, and health implications that we should be understanding. And so from that conversation, our city manager agreed to strike a team. We got legal representation and applied to be a part of the Trans Mountain Pipeline hearing process.
Okay, so you became part of that process, and I know one of the things you wanted to do was look at their risk assessment and critique it to see how effective it was.
Mhm.
And I was part of that in a small way. So as you engaged Trans Mountain Pipeline and the consulting firms that they were using, how did that go?
Um, we didn't directly engage with Trans Mountain Pipeline at the time. We sort of engaged through the National Energy Board process. And so what the process looked like, which was highly flawed. That's just not just my opinion. That was the opinion of many legal experts. But what the process looked like was that there was no in-person expert, no space for in-person expert witnesses or cross-examination. All of the questions and answers were to be done through a written process. So we were given a 16,000 page application. I think we were given probably something like 10 days to read it and put forward all of our questions to Trans Mountain and to their
Sorry,
very,
did you say 10 days for 16,000 pages?
it was something like that. It
Okay.
was,
And
yes.
how many people at your end were working on this?
At first, I want to say there was 2 or 3. Our team grew. It was myself, um, our lawyer, and we had some part-time support from an environmental manager, a colleague of mine, Jen, and also we had, it might have just been the 3 of us at that point. Eventually our team grew, and I think there were about 5 of us working on it. We needed to hire somebody just to help us manage the data because there was a 16,000 page application. But then after that, after all of the participants in the process were able to submit their questions and file their own evidence, then there was, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of pages worth of documentation that we needed to go through and organize. And we always had these very short turnaround periods. So that in and of itself was was not, it wasn't set up for success. And of course, one of the challenges when you don't have in-person hearings and opportunities to question the experts is that no one else benefits from hearing what those questions are. So, we may have asked the same question as Burnaby, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, other communities and First Nations around the inlet that had concerns. And instead of getting a direct response from Trans Mountain, they would say, see question 4.1.5 on page blah, blah, blah from blah, blah, blah. And then that question would say, see the response to question 5.2. So it was just this insane, it felt intentionally, it felt like obfuscation on just a really dramatic level. But yeah, anyway, so we would submit our questions to the experts. We had to demonstrate how those questions aligned with the 12 points that the National Energy Board had agreed to evaluate. And then Trans Mountain would either have their experts respond to those questions, or Trans Mountain would say that question is not relevant. And then if they said it was not relevant or we didn't agree with their question, we could then request the National Energy Board to intervene and make a ruling on whether or not our questions were relevant. The large majority of questions that we asked pertaining to public safety and emergency management and marine oil spills were deemed by Trans Mountain and often the National Energy Board to be irrelevant.
So when you think back to that now, it was a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how much objectivity do you think was displayed by the National Energy Board in terms of their judgments?
None. The National Energy Board at that time, the representatives on the National Energy Board were based in Calgary, and were primarily former executives of energy companies.
Okay.
It was very difficult. You know, I think we went into that process really hopeful that we would have a fair opportunity to present evidence and get clear responses to questions based on a federally regulated approach. And it became very clear from the outset that the National Energy Board was designing the process. So one of the things that the National Energy Board did at that time, I think maybe the rules have changed, but they got to design a unique process for every application. In most processes, they had in-person hearings. If you recall, just before the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the Enbridge pipeline had gone forward with a massive backlash from communities all along that pipeline in the north. And it felt like the National Energy Board was trying to avoid the type of in-person expert interviews and hearings that they had for the Enbridge pipeline. And so they created a very narrow box for what they said mattered and what they said they would assess in terms of what was required to approve or recommend approval of the Trans Mountain pipeline.
That must have been incredibly frustrating for you.
Yeah, it really was. And in particular, at that point early on, you know, it wasn't just that, you know, the city of Vancouver was ultimately opposed to the pipeline for a number of reasons, including the anticipated climate impacts and the potential for a massive investment in what would ultimately be a stranded asset if decarbonization policies actually came to be, which now they have. But we were also willing to say, you know, from an emergency management perspective, we will work with you. There's already an existing pipeline. It's already shipping oil. We already have these huge unmitigated risks because there's no plans for our community. So even if, you know, you don't cancel the whole pipeline, at least acknowledge that you are significantly increasing the risk to our community, that you already own an aging pipeline that has spilled more than 60 times, and that oil spills have significant social, cultural, economic, and environmental threats to our city. If you can acknowledge those things, we can work from there. That's what we do as emergency managers, to figure out how we can mitigate those risks and better prepare our communities if they happen. But by virtue of the fact of Trans Mountain Pipeline and the National Energy Board saying these questions and these issues are out of scope for the project, it meant that it was just like banging your head against a wall. You couldn't, like, you just couldn't have, you didn't have the inroad to have that conversation.
I remember when I first looked at their risk assessment in terms of oil spills out in the water. They had divided the areas up in a whole bunch of boxes, little boxes and bigger boxes. Yeah. And there were 2 or 3 areas that they excluded from the risk analysis. The rationale was that the probability of a spill was so low that it didn't require a risk analysis to be done. Because the risk was already so low, which is sort of strange thinking, because it's presuming the outcome of the risk analysis to determine where you need to do the risk analysis on the basis of probability alone, whereas risk is probability times consequences, you know, times exposure. And those areas just happen to be right adjacent to the city of Vancouver.
The most
This
densely
must have
populated
been,
urban area in North America,
sorry, I missed that.
which is the most densely populated urban area in North America.
So I found that shocking as a I didn't live in Vancouver and I wasn't deeply involved in the process. Like, how did you react to that one thing alone?
Oh, I mean, having come through the York program and taken your courses and having a fairly strong understanding of the definition of risk as not just being probability, it to me it was just like, are they just trying to slide one through here? Like, what the heck is going on? This is obscene. Risk is about consequence, and that's why we exist. We don't, as emergency managers, our job is important because of consequence.
So when you pointed out to the National Energy Board that those areas are important to you guys,
Mhm.
and risk is more than just probability, what kind of response did you get?
You know, I don't I don't recall specifically like the National Energy Board's position on it. There was at one point an expansion of the issues, and we actually had to go to the Federal Court of Appeal in order to advance that. So City of Vancouver partnered with, we created a working group with a number of the local First Nations and other local municipalities because we needed to be, we felt that we'd be more powerful as a group, but we all had this issue that the lack of consequence was, was appalling. The lack of consequence assessment in their risk equation was appalling. And eventually we were allowed to submit evidence to that regard. Now, I don't believe that um, I don't, so to date, actually, yeah, so we asked them to submit evidence based on consequence. The Trans Mountain Pipeline never actually was required to do that type of consequence assessment. And to date, as far as I know, the only modeling of an oil spill that has been done for that area was led by our coalition of communities and First Nations surrounding the inlet. So the National Energy Board accepted our submission of our oil spill response, or sorry, our oil spill model and our consequence assessment. But Trans Mountain was never forced to do that work.
Okay.
Trans Mountain further defined, and I believe that National Energy Board accepted that definition, consequence as the volume of oil spilled.
Okay. That's a very limited definition of consequence.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny.
So I'm when you to what extent would you say when you emerged from school you were idealistic, and to what extent would you say you've become jaded over time?
That experience for me, that Trans Mountain experience was formative in that I did want to believe in our democratic processes. And I wanted to believe that even if we didn't, even if our position wasn't the one that won or advanced, that we would at least trigger better responses from government. And I was so disheartened by continuously being told that public safety and emergency management questions were relevant to the process. And I was so disheartened by the at that time, the government, the Coast Guard, like many government agencies, in really pushing this through at all cost, that I would say that particular experience, that was yeah, that made me particularly cynical. And then and that of course was under a conservative government. And I remember being really hopeful that a liberal government would change that. And then a liberal government made a whole bunch of commentary around the inadequacies of the conservative process, and then proceeded to reapprove the Trans Mountain Pipeline without a single changes in the recommendations. And so that experience in general made me quite jaded. What I will say, though, I had had a lot of other experiences in emergency management and resilience that give me all kinds of hope, but just hope in different places. And I have more hope probably in the power of citizens than I do in the power of bureaucracies to actually, um, build resilience and have better outcomes in the context of disaster and emergency management. I have more hope in, the power of partnerships and innovation and and I've experienced emergence and I've experienced change in the aftermath of disasters that is often not driven um, through those government agencies, although sometimes it is. So maybe the location of where I put my hope has changed.
Oh, that's a very interesting comment. I wonder if we could switch directions a bit now, and if you could talk about um, the job itself and how it affected you working, in your career, in your 11 years
Mm-hmm.
uh, in the field. So here we have like young professionals who are going to be entering the field, and like everybody deals with work-life balance and the stresses of employment and so forth, and working in challenging jobs and challenging roles. So what was your experience like that way?
I first I was extremely lucky to work um, for the majority of my emergency management career in the city of Vancouver. Um, Relative to a lot of colleagues that I had in other municipalities, this is a fairly progressive place, and so they're quite. I found the leadership at that time to be quite open to recommendations. That said, emergency management in Canada and around the world, I think still um, suffers from from um, a chronic lack of resources, and um, and I and so that it means it's a constant struggle to um, sort of validate or expand to a point where you can actually serve all elements of, if you want to say, the emergency management cycle: preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. And so a lot of my emergency management experience initially was really geared at response and response planning. And I would say one element that contributed to ultimately probably my own burnout, but also many others, is the continued response to situations where um, that no matter what anyone says, those situations were predictable. They were actually probably likely. They are rooted in the social and economic inequities of our communities. And as an emergency manager, you can give someone 72 hours worth of support and then return them directly to the conditions that fostered or created that emergency. And so you often felt, you would get this high. I would get this high when you're responding and helping and you're in action. And I really love the logistics element of that and getting things done. But then the lack of follow through on recovery, on resilient recovery is heartbreaking. And I think that the language is now out in our society, and particularly in after the experience of COVID, people understand about resilient recovery and the concept of building back better, even though there's problems with that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how long it's going to take to make that shift. I kind of went all over the place there, but
Okay, so you used the word burnout for yourself, and I know others who would use that word to describe themselves. So you used it specifically in terms of the frustration you felt in terms of people and communities following a disaster, and a lack of sense that you've placed them in an environment where they're better off than they were before. What about you in terms of like your workload? You did your 40 hours a week, and then you got to go home and have dinner, stuff like that, play games, see friends?
Never. I never did that. No, that's also I have learned that I have to take responsibility for some of that too, but there's a point where when you're in the heat of a crisis, or you have the weight of every disaster that might happen tomorrow on your shoulders, it's really difficult to ever feel like you're done. And I think that I just remember when I first got my job with the city of Vancouver, I was so excited to work on these challenges, but I also felt like, that the issues were never ending. There was going to be an earthquake, or there was going to be a heat wave, or we were dealing with climate change, or like that. It could be overwhelming. And I would wake up in the middle of the night, like having dreamt that there was an earthquake, or every time, because we were on call also, so you'd hear a siren go by and you just shoot up, like it was really hard to shut off for a number of reasons. And I think for me also the sense of responsibility of, which is a little bit crazy and maybe a bit egotistical, but you sort of as the emergency manager, which there was 9 of us I started, there's 4 of us in our office, then there's 9 of us. Many communities have 1 or 0.5 emergency managers, and as the emergency manager, if something goes wrong, you feel personally responsible for the hazard occurring in the first place, the response or lack thereof, and the number of people that are calling you to tell you that they hadn't received their training, or they didn't feel prepared, or like there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot on your shoulders, and it takes time, I think, to recognize that no single person could possibly take on everything that an emergency manager thinks that they are supposed to do.
So you must have known that intellectually, even at the time.
I don't know. I'm pretty sure there was a time when I thought I could resolve all of those things.
You were Superwoman.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah. But I wasn't.
If you're going to give some advice to people just entering the field, who are going to say end up in the public sector the way you did, what advice would you give them?
I would say that in this line of work that can feel sometimes so isolating, that establishing strong relationships is exceptionally important. strong relationships across sectors, across departments. Because that enables you to seed understanding of emergency management principles, and the essential need for emergency management across the departments that you might be working with. If you try and hold tight and be the only one responsible for emergency management, then you are the only one responsible for emergency management, and no one else is going to prioritize that until it actually happens. But if you can facilitate those relationships and actively make time to actively engage in local planning meetings and infrastructure planning meetings and weigh in on social and health plans, then you can help to, I guess, mainstream concepts and principles behind emergency management and resilience that will in the long run help you to feel not alone and give you huge support from colleagues.
Are you a proponent of emergency management functions being more distributed in
Yes.
terms of policy and legal requirements? You are, okay. You
Yeah.
feel they're too centralized right now?
I think it's a both and, like you need both and.
Yeah, okay.
But I do feel that, unless you're FEMA, a city in the United States, and FEMA is funding ICS training for every single one of your staff across your entire organization, your implementation of the incident command system is going to fall flat on its face when you try and host a response and you pull everyone into this hierarchical command structure with a bunch of vests and stripes that they've never seen before in the middle of a crisis, and ask them to change the way they were always doing everything and report to someone they've never seen using language they've never used. Like that, yeah. I yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done in both in terms of the questioning the validity of the application of ICS in some circumstances from a response perspective, but more broadly in terms of risk governance writ large in public sector organizations.
Oh, that's interesting. When you first started to work, you had your degree in your hand and you were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. How prepared were you for this field as a new graduate?
I think I was as prepared as anyone. I at the time, there weren't many degrees in emergency management.
No.
I brought different strengths to that team and different experiences to that team than currently existed. There was no one in my office with formal emergency management training outside of what was offered through the Justice Institute of BC, which is a great organization, but it's very functional.
Yeah.
But through York, and based on my own personal experience in the tsunami, I had thought really deeply about risk and vulnerability and the social construct of disasters and organizational behavior. And so I felt that I was actually quite well positioned to take on some of the challenges I was being asked to take on in the city's Office of Emergency Management. What I lacked was incident command training, like the British Columbia context, knowledge of that legislation, et cetera, et cetera. But that's stuff you can read. That's easy. Relative to sort of the theory and the value of having studied and experienced disasters from a number of different angles.
Katie, I would like to thank you so much for your generosity in taking your time to share your perspectives on all these issues. And I'm sure the students who look at this are going to really appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dave.